We will go ahead and get started. So again, thank you all for joining us this morning. We have gathered together a few folks here to talk about this topic about enabling multi-factor authentication on your VPNs. So I will do a round of introductions and kick us off with the agenda, and then we'll get right into the content here. So Diane, next slide, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim Wease. I work with Department of Public Instruction and working in cybersecurity, supporting all the schools in North Carolina.
So I am Ruthie Mabe. I'm the Director of Cybersecurity Services here at MCNC.
I'm Diane Dunlap. I'm on the CNE team at MCNC, and I do a lot of the VPN.
So I'm Gons. Those of you who don't know me, I work with the CNE team, and myself and Diane work on a lot of these projects together.
We're getting ready to turn it over to Tim Wease. He's going to kick us off and give us some content around what's been going on that caused the announcement from DPI on Friday, and then the subsequent announcements from me yesterday, and now this webinar today. We're going to hand it over to Diane. She's going to walk through some background of the work that's been done to date by MCNC supporting our community about enabling MFA in your environment. Then she's going to pop into an overview of if you are new to MFA, if you do not currently utilize that in your environment. She's going to review the common MFA options that are utilized by many of the PSUs in our community. From there, we'll go to PSUs that already use MFA. There's some basic training that we can do to provide you the skills to be able to go in and check yourself if your MFA is configured correctly in that authentication tool. So we'll walk through some of those things. And then at the end, we'll get into contact information, next steps, additional resources, and questions. So then let's go to the next slide if you can, Diane.
Just to provide a little context around what we've seen and what we're seeing out in the environment today, and why this announcement came out, we are seeing some increased threat activity. This is not specific to North Carolina in any way, but we have seen some specific threat activity within North Carolina recently that has required some additional resources spent on situations. So their threat activity is going on. As you can see, the 24,000 IPs targeting PAN-OS Global Protect coordinated login scan information that Ruthie's put on this slide. That is not specific to North Carolina, but it is a global threat, and threat actors are utilizing this to identify VPNs and to target VPNs as a primary source of an attack. Once they gain access to that, they're able to lead to a full network breach. Any VPN that is not protected by MFA is suspect to compromise at this time. So the MFA really does add an additional layer or second layer of security beyond just that username and password, and it makes it significantly more difficult for attackers to gain access into your network. Also protects you from attack methods such as password spraying, credential stuffing, or other brute force methods. So this is just a good step in making sure that we're protecting the resources and the assets of our students and our staff within our environments. So what we've done from DPI's perspective is we're starting to require any PSU that is on the state firewall to enable MFA for any SSL VPN user accounts within their environment. What this means today is that if you are on the state provided firewall, you need to open a ticket with SecOps if you do not have MFA deployed on your state provided firewall. In the future, you will see a contract amendment coming from MCNC with a no-cost statement of work that will require the PSUs to attest that MFA requirement is being met in order to continue that VPN access, but that will be in the future, and we'll talk more about that later in this meeting. Another point of clarification is the MFA requirement does fall a lot on the PSU to make sure that that control is configured and enforced on your side, and we'll go through that and show you that. One other thing that I'd like to make note of is that some of this stuff really relates back to some of the things that you have to do for a cybersecurity insurance requiremments, and this will help you be able to check more boxes if you're not currently doing it when you do your attestations for those cybersecurity enforcements. One last note that I would make is if you're not doing MFA on other things, I'm a big proponent of MFA for all, so please consider deploying and enforcing MFA on other accounts, and we will continue pushing that fact as we go through and continue this journey of trying to help all our PSUs achieve essential cyber hygiene.
And on that last point, when we were preparing for today's webinar, there was a lot of discussion around how broad in scope we could go, specifically to talking about enabling MFA on services even outside of VPN. So that is what today's content is about, right? Specifically to your VPNs. But as Tim said, we definitely encourage you tomorrow, right, to consider how you can enable MFA for those other services. So thank you for that introduction, Tim. All right. And
Thanks.
so Diane, I think you are up next and you have the rest of the content.
All right. So I've been working on the whole Google 365 project for probably 5 years. At this point, we have 235 PSUs on DPI provided Palo Alto firewalls. And we've been working specifically on getting the remainder of the folks on for the last 18 months, really kind of targeted and figured out, okay, these folks aren't on there. I call them, email them, and so on, trying to get them over to Google or 365 or Duo actually there. At this point in time, we have at least 25% of PSUs that only have single-factor authentication on for VPN. We know that because they're either doing local accounts or Active Directory, and those are typically not capable of doing multi-factor authentication. Now, you can do Active Directory with Duo, and you can, but we're not kind of counting that. So we know at least 25% are unsafe because they're not doing multi-factor, but we don't have visibility into folks' Google, okay? So that's something that we're going to kind of speak to here. We know it's at least 25%, but it could be worse. So I put this in as an authentication option. Turning off VPN is an option. And with some of the sites where I have been looking at their logs and saying, oh my gosh, hackers are trying to get in, typically we'll see about 65,000 attempts, and 65,000 because that's the limit of the log system in the Palo Alto within 2 days. Okay, so when I contact a school and say, hey, we're seeing 65,000 attempts to get into your network within 2 days, some of the responses like, hey, we're not using it anyhow, just turn it off. And that's perfectly valid. If you don't have any contractors needing to get into your network, if you don't need to get into your network remotely, just turn it off. So that is an option. But most folks are going with Google. About 95% of our folks are doing Google for the VPN authentication. The rest are doing either 365 Entra Azure in the cloud or Active Directory with Duo, with the radius option. In other words, you set up a radius server, it's pointing to Duo, it's also pointing to Active Directory there. We haven't really worked with non-MCNC firewall customers. If you don't have an MCNC firewall, the thing to do would be to check with your vendor to see what are the limits they support. Like if you have a FortiGate firewall, you can do Forti tokens. Maybe you have a checkpoint, an ASA, whatever. Just check with the vendor initially to see what your options are. And you can open a ticket with us. We'll help you if we can on that. We're just not familiar with the other vendors on this. And this basically shows graphically how you would have the Palo Alto. If you're talking to Google, it would be in the cloud. If you're talking to 365 Entra, it would be in the cloud. Whereas inside, you would have your Active Directory and Duo. So this just kind of shows you a screenshot of how that looks. Typically, you would want to have VPN rules tied to groups in Google, Entra, or AD. In other words, you're not going to give everybody access to everything. You're going to be fairly decisive to say the heating and air conditioning people need access to their stuff. The IT department needs access to everything, but those are typically tied to rules that you would be using in the cloud service. We typically want least privilege on rules. In other words, the heating and air conditioning people don't need to get to everything. Just give them access to the heating and air conditioning stuff. And it's typically controlled by IP address, in other words, where they need to go to inside the network. And we can also go down to the port level in there, okay? So if you don't need to give a contractor access to all the ports anywhere, we can do that down to the port level. but you just need to be able to tell us what port's there. If you're using a cloud service like Link, which would typically be in an LEA, we can also do kind of a hairpin turn arrangement so that your finance people who need to get to Link from their homes would be VPNing into the school, and then there'd be a hairpin turn back out to Link. So we can take care of that kind of access too. Then the vendors, on the accounts you're setting up for the vendors, they don't need Google Docs. They need Google Slides or Drive, anything like that. They really need just minimal access, because sometimes those questions come up. What kind of access do we need to give the vendors? Really nothing much except for Gmail account to be able to get in there. We would probably have people who don't have any kind of Google or 365 setup or AD Google or AD Duo setup, okay? And then we have other people who have this set up, but they don't have the two-factor maybe set up in Google. So for the people who don't have anything set up for Google 365 or Duo, the typical steps here would be you would have to name your firewall, okay? If you're currently accessing your firewall by an IP address, you would need to have a DNS-A record to give the firewall a fully qualified name. And this is typically based on the school website. Like if your school website is school.k12.nc.us, your firewall, you might want to call it fw.school.k12.us, okay? So you would have to do an A record with your registrar for the firewall, okay? Once you have the A record, MCNC would create a certificate signing request for the site. We would give you that certificate signing request, and then you would purchase and download the purchase certificate. Now, the cost of the certificates, the GoDaddy ones are $70 a year. About, if you get them multiple years, it's cheaper. But Sectigo has gone down on their price. You can get those for $13 a year. So you purchase the certificate, you download the certificate, you provide the certificate to us, and then we install the certificate on the firewall. And typically, I would meet with you via a Zoom to set up Google. And I'm saying Google just because 95% of the accounts are doing Google. So we decide in your Google what groups need access to. The setup needs to be done in Google. And then after that, our SecOps team would create rules and modify rules, and they would do a correlation based on the Google groups to say rule number 79, we used to be using local accounts there. We're going to flip that over to Google. Rule number 80, used to be using local. We're going to flip that over to Google. The setup on the firewall. If you don't have this setup at all, that's what we'd be working with you on. I'm just going to briefly play a video showing how the login would look with the two-factor on Google. Okay, I'm going to demonstrate Global Protect using two-factor authentication. Hit the connect button here. And it knows we're on Google, so the screen pops up. Okay, and since mine is set for sending me a text, I'm going to have to enter that at this point. If you were tied to Google Authenticator, you'd be having to do that. All right, and it worked. Okay, so as you know, when you're doing Google or any of these cloud services, if there are different components, so you might be doing Gmail, you might be doing Google Docs, you might be doing spreadsheets, slides, whatever. When you're opening a different tab, you're typically not having to re-authenticate every time. You're typically not having to do the two-factor every time because the cookie is stored. Okay, so it's the same thing with Global Protect. Sometimes you'll be asked for your token, okay, and sometimes you won't. It will really depend on the status of your PC or your MacBook or whatever, as far as whether you'll be asked for that code at any given time, okay? But it still counts as two-factor if you have it on and you're enforcing it for the user. I know some folks on the call already have Google set up or 365 set up. I'm going to speak to how to tell if you have two-factor enforced in your Google, okay? So if you go into your Google and look at apps and web and mobile apps, when I work with folks to set this up, you will have an app in there. It might be called Palo Alto CIE. That's what ours is called. Yours might be called Firewall. It might be called Palo, but you will see where in the ACS URL, it says something about Palo Alto Networks.com. Okay. So that's the one you're looking for. And you can see where we have it on for 7 groups in ours, which is kind of overkill. I don't think anybody has it on for 7 groups, but those are the groups you'd be concerned about. Okay. So you need to be sure that the users in those groups have 2-factor enabled for themselves, that they have enrolled, and that they have it enforced. So this just shows an example how you can go into your Google directory. You're going to look at groups, and you can see here, and let's see, okay, where I'm showing 2 of my groups. In my one group, I have 8 users. In the other group, I have 7 users. If you're a small site and you're very familiar with your groups and you say, hey, I've only got 2 users in this group, I know for those users, we have it enforced, we have it enabled, they've enrolled. That might be all you'll need to do because you're very familiar with it, okay? But if you're a larger site, it becomes a little more difficult to figure out if you do have it enabled for the users and enforced for the users. So how to tell if you have it enforced and enabled? If you go into reporting, then user reports, security, that is where you can actually look to see what the status is for your various users. I'm going to hit the escape here and actually go into our Google, okay, and into reporting to show this more live, okay? So I'm in user reports and security, like you saw there, okay? And you can see, I mean, it's a lab. If we look at the general population, we get gobs users, about nobody is enrolled in 2-factor authentication, and about nobody having enforced 2-step verification, but it's a lab. I mean, it is what it is, okay? So if we wanted to find out more specifically about those groups, though, we would want to look only at the groups, okay? We can do a group filter here. So we're going to hit the group filter button here. And if you currently see nothing here, when you hit the group filtering button, you will have to hit this button here in order to add the groups of interest, okay? So you're going to hit the add groups button. Maybe I want to add administration here, hit the add button. And when I do that, now I can possibly look at the status of everybody in that administration group. So I'm going to go back into reporting, user report security, and I think I might not have saved, but that's okay. But now when we go into the group filter, I can say, hey, all I want to see are those 7 groups, okay? And I don't actually have all 7 groups here, but I'm going to hit apply, okay? And you can see where these users are in the groups of interest, okay? Still, it doesn't look good here because nobody's enrolled and nobody's enforced here. I wish there was a column in Google to show what OU they're in, but there's not, okay? But hopefully you would know and you would be able to click on these users, click on Chris Lovett. Let's see. All right, and you can see where Chris Lovett is in the Got to Love It OU, okay? So we see where Chris Lovett does not have 2-factor authentication on, it's not enforced. Okay, so we're going to now have to go into security. Okay, and then authentication, 2-step verification. And 2-step verification is enforced not at the group level, but at the OU level. It just is. That's the way Google does this. Okay, so we'll pick on Chris Lovett. Okay, and here's his OU. Okay. And he could turn on 2-factor authentication if he wanted to, because it's set for allow users to turn on 2-step verification, but the enforcement is off. We need to have the enforcement on because suppose Chris he is able to do it, but he hasn't turned it on. Maybe he decides to turn it on, but he's having a bad day. He says, I don't want this on anymore. We need to have it set for on or on from a specific date. Okay, so if you're just seeing it's allowed, you probably have some security conscious users who have decided to do this, but if you're not enforcing it, they could turn it off. Okay, so we can make it on from a specific date and choose a specific date, or we could give them a grace period in here of your however much a month. So if we made it a grace period, every time Chris would be getting into the Google, which he doesn't get into the Google very often, it would remind him and say, hey, Chris, you need to do this. Hey, Chris, you need to do this. Okay. Then at the end of the grace period, it's, you know, the trap is kind of closed on these people, and they're going to have to be doing two-factor at this point in time. There are a lot of settings in here. Typically would have allow user to trust the device, and we talked the cookies being stored there. The methods, the least restrictive are listed first. So this would be your pieces of paper, your Google Authenticator, your texts, and so on. Next would be any verification code via text or phone call. And then the most restrictive would be your security keys, like your UB keys and so on. Okay. We'll have a link at the end of the slide presentation that shows there was another presentation given a few months ago. Corey at Pitt is heavily involved with this, and he talks about all these options and the differences and so on in Google. Okay, and again, are we allowing users to generate security codes and so on in there? But those are your options in there. Okay. So that would be your way of determining if everybody in a group that has Palo Alto VPN access has VPN turned on, and then to be able to look in the OU to see, are we enforcing it? Or if we're not enforcing it, how would we turn it on there? Now, it would be nice if Google allowed you to turn on two-factor at the group level, but it doesn't. It allows you to turn it on at the OU level. But it does allow you to exempt groups from two-step verification by putting people in a group. So if you had 100 users in an OU and you decided that 5 of them didn't need to have two-step verification on for whatever reason, you could put those users in a group and then they would not have to do two-step verification. Okay. Google kind of goes into some ins and outs on this in this document. Another in or out would be if you're moving users around in Google. Okay. For example, if you had somebody who maybe was on the custodial staff, and they didn't need to have two-factor on, or you didn't deem that necessary for them, but then they got a promotion, they're moved to the IT staff, and all of a sudden the IT staff needs to have two-factor on, all of a sudden they're locked out of their email and so on. So Google kind of goes into the ins and outs of two-step verification, why you might want to use groups, why you might want to use temporary codes and so on. Some of these things might help with the pain points when you're looking at turning this on. Briefly, this is how to see who's trying to get into your firewall. If you have read-only access to the firewall, under Monitor, Global Protect, and this is just from our firewall in the lab, you can see where we're searching for status equals failure. And these are the people trying to get into your system. And Ruthie asked me this morning if we needed to obfuscate the user names of these people. And I said, no, because they're all hackers. Okay. But if you were interested in doing status equals success, you could do that too. But the thing is, the firewall will not send you alerts when these kinds of things are going on. So I'm showing you how you can look at this in Google, which would be more useful. So in your Google, if you go under reports and audit and investigation, SAML log events, okay, you can see my application name is Palo Alto CIE. And we looked at that a few slides ago. And in there, you can see where our application name is Palo Alto CIE, and you can see who logged in at any given time. Okay, so these were, you can look at the time the user logged in, you can add different fields to this. So if your finance person said, hey, I tried to log in and I couldn't, or, you know, something happened or whatever, you can actually look to see, to verify that they really did, or when they were in, or if there was some discrepancy there, or, you know, argument about whether somebody tried to log in or not. You can also look at failures, okay? So if you wanted to see if a user tried to log in, okay, so our user who's always trying to get into our network is Big Cootie, okay? He's one of our students. And if you looked in your logs, you would see where he had an unsuccessful login, okay? I'm also going to show, because you can set up email alerts on this, okay? Let's see. So it's going to be reporting. Let's see. Audit and investigation, and then SAML log events. Okay, so you could create a reporting rule in here. So if you wanted to know if a student tried to get in, you could cruise through and create a reporting rule in here. And then at the very end, it says, what do you want to do? And I think the default was to send email to all the administrators. And I since went in and removed my rule because I didn't want to aggravate everybody in our little group here. But yeah, you could send it to a specific email when somebody tried to sneak in using Google or whatever. So it's very useful to be able to do this in Google, because you can't do this in the Palo Alto with the kind of access you have. And that was about all I had. So let's see, I'm going to turn it over to, I think, to Ruthie and Tim here.
Thank you, Diane. So I know there's been a lot of questions that have been coming in through the Q&A. So I think Gons has been answering some of those via text as they've come in. And then there's a couple that we're going to answer live here in just a minute. But I just wanted to summarize where we are right now, right? Summary of next steps. So the recommendation again from DPI is that PSU should immediately enable MFA on VPN accounts or disable VPN. Right. So as Diane just showed us, even if if using an MFA capable tool like Google, you may not have MFA enabled on the users themselves that need to have that enforced. So PSU should double check to confirm that those users and groups with VPN access have MFA enforced. VPN access on the NC DPI firewall service must have MFA enabled, right? So that is now a requirement from DPI. So if you don't have that enabled today, you must engage with us by the end of the day, by 4 p.m. tomorrow, or be at risk of your VPN being disabled. And then as Tim mentioned, in the near future, PSUs utilizing the state provided firewall will be receiving a contract amendment from MCNC acknowledging that there's been a change to the service, right, that requires MFA to be enabled in order to utilize the VPN. But as Diane was showing, right, there's a piece of it that says the PSUs themselves have to manage most of the pieces in your actual authentication tool, right? So that's not something that MCNC can manage for you. Therefore, that amendment, right, and the attestation from you will state that, you know, the PSU is responsible for enforcing that access both with current and future VPN users. Tim, anything before we go to the contact slide, anything that you would want to add to this sort of summary and next steps page?
No, I don't have anything to add. I just want to express my appreciation to y'all for your work that you've done in the past for deploying this MFA option on the state provided firewall and getting us into a position where we are have a smaller lift to get everybody across the finish line on this, and make sure that just reiterate that this MFA requirement does apply to any and all users on the SSL VPN, the Global Connect through the Palo appliance. So, and thank y'all again.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tim. All right. So Diane, if you could go to that last slide then. So this is going to have our contact information. So for support, right, if you think that you are on that list where MFA is not currently enabled, or if you've received an email from me in the past 24 hours saying that we think that you are probably on that list, right, please contact secops@mcnc.org. That'll open a case and we will be able to manage that process for you and supporting you. So additional points of contact. So Tim willingly allowed me to put his email address on this slide. So Tim's contact is there. My direct email address is on this slide as well. So one thing I rather than create a whole nother slide for, I did want to add this. That link is for the webinar series. So the practical MFA use for cases and technical configuration options for PSUs. So that is a webinar that NC DPI with the Friday Institute and several community partners did last month. And that link is to the slides. So I'll be sending out the slide deck here later today, so you'll get that link as well. But the point of me highlighting that is, we had an hour today. We're going to go through some questions, but if you want to deeper dive into this, right, that's 2 hours of content and the slide materials there for you as well. So with that, let me open it up for questions.
There was a question about are the scans all or attacks from US base? No. Have there been geo policies enabled or conditional access policies been implemented for this threat? So anyone who's gone through the firewall hardening process, they actually do have geo blocks in there for anything other than the US and Canada. Also, the SecOps team has worked with Palo Alto to deploy a threat ID to identify these spraying attacks and block them. So that is actually in place, and we are seeing quite a few hits on that policy. But if you have not gone through the hardening process, there is not a geo block, but that is something that we definitely recommend if you haven't gone through it to definitely get on the schedule to go through that process.
And frankly, I mean, even if there's a geo block, the US is in the top 10 usually, if not the top 5.
Yeah.
So it doesn't do a whole lot.
But the new threat ID is actually cutting down on that traffic. So, well, not on the traffic itself because we're seeing it, but it is dropping those connections. Can a rule be put in place to limit VPN connectivity to only a single address? Yes, but why? Because your users are coming from everywhere. So it's kind of hard for us to pin it to a single address and get it to work. I understand what you're saying to limit interruption, but who is this one person and how would this be implemented? So that to me would be a request that you may want to make, and we could investigate it further.
Yeah, I think they're meaning a small school, one person and their home address is always the same.
Yeah, but it's not, well, we can't guarantee it all.
Yeah, mine's usually the same, but yeah.
Currently, we only have 3 users that are configured for AD dual radius. So if you're one of those, then yes, you're good. If you're not, then you're not covered. If you're using dual inside your environment and you're using it as a radiuser for AD and what have you, definitely reach out. We could open a ticket. We can work with you to get that configured. But like I said, there's only 3 people that are currently configured that way. So I'm gonna assume you know who you are.
Yeah, and I think you can get free duo if it's less than 10 seats on that. Yeah, so we just set it up in the lab. Now somebody asked about Let's Encrypt could be used.
That is in EIT's
we're studying
realm
that.
of responsibility.
Yeah.
They are currently reviewing that. It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow.
Okay, and so for folks who have not received an email from Ruthie saying they're on the list, can we assume that Google is in good order? Yes and no, because we don't have access. We have not gone in and examined people's Google. We don't necessarily have accounts to be able to go in and examine people's Google. Okay. So as shown in the webinar, you need to be able to go into reports, security and all that, and refer to the webinar and say, this is how I'm going to look to figure out, do I have it enabled? Are the people enrolled and so on? So you're responsible for your Google piece. John or I or people on our team can help you with that, but you need to look at your Google to make sure you're compliant.
Yeah. And one thing I'll add to that, Diane, is that, the list of folks that I was contacting directly are ones that based on their current configuration and the review that we were able to do, we are making the assumption that MFA is not enabled, right? So based on the configuration. So if you're using Google, that's what Diane is saying, right? We can't go into your Google instance and determine that the users and groups are set up. It's the separate configuration that we can see that kind of got you on my list to reach out to directly.
Okay. Now, if somebody saying it's a small site, so they only have one user that needs MFA on, they're using Active Directory. And so if you're using Active Directory, you probably don't have it set on in Active Directory, which would mean you would need to move to Google.
The only way we could do it in Active Directory would be using dual radius.
Yeah.
So if you're on Google, it would make sense to get you converted to Google for Google SAML for the Palo, and then at that point we could work with you to make sure the MFA is enabled in Google for that user.
Okay, and there's a question about SSL VPN. I think that's just more of a nomenclature thing.
It's what everyone else calls their VPN. We use a client. We're using the Global Protect client. It does have a fallback feature to SSL VPN, but it's not something that we use all the time.
So when we're saying SSL VPN, we actually mean Global Protect, basically.
When we're talking about the MCNC firewall, right? But if you're
correct.
PSU that's not using ours, it could be something else.
Right. Fortinet calls it SSL VPN, but I believe there's also a Fortinet client. So, you know.
With Fortinet tokens. Yep. Okay. Now somebody said if they didn't want to have two-step on for an entire Google OU, could you create a group to do that? No, in Google, you can't turn it on a per group level. So you can't include on a per group level, but you can exclude on a group level. Okay. And I kind of covered that in the webinar, but that's in the Google Doc we referenced it there shows how to exclude. Okay, so if you have 100 users in the group and you have two that you don't need to have two-factor on for whatever reason, you put them in a group and then you tell Google that group is not going to have it. Okay.
So someone was asking, how do I access my AD servers without remote access for updates? I'm going to assume they mean RDP. What we recommend is that you VPN into your network and then at that point start an RDP session to those servers.
The idea would be the VPN would be through Google, and then once authenticated through Google, you would RDP to the server. Okay.
Once you've established a VPN connection.
So yeah, I can clarify that question. So the deadline for tomorrow at 4 p.m. is if you are not currently utilizing MFA on the VPN on the state provided firewall service, which is the MCNC Palo Alto firewall service, then you need to be in contact with MCNC by 4 p.m. tomorrow so we can get you started on that process. All right. So if we've identified you as being one of those schools that we are fairly certain, right, based on the configuration that you do not have MFA enabled, I've already reached out to you and communicated with you. That list is what we are working down. And Tim and I will then sync up tomorrow on disabling those VPNs through the SecOps group here at MCNC if we haven't heard back from you.
Okay, and then there's a question from someone here. How long does it take to get a CSR once DNS name has been configured? An hour, maybe?
Yeah, it doesn't take long to generate a CSR. We just need to know what domain is going to be part of it.
Yeah, I think we're up to date on any CSRs, although I might have a few in my queue, but yeah. There's a question about doing a CSR. If there's a ticket open, which that would be the first thing to do, open a ticket by emailing secops@mcnc.org. They open the ticket, and then I look up to see if the firewall has a fully qualified name. You decide the name for the firewall, okay? Then once the firewall is named, I have the folks on the SecOps team do a CSR. I just look up the name of the school, the location of the school, the state, the country, the fully qualified name. I ask them to do a CSR. They create the CSR. I get that to the requester, and then the requester buys the certificate from either GoDaddy or Sectigo. Okay, and I can actually put a link in here. Let me see.
So along those same lines as Diane was mentioning, there has to be a fully qualified domain name. If we manage your DNS for us, you tell us what it is, we put it in. If someone else is managing your DNS for you, you need to go get that record created before we can actually use it as part of a CSR.
So I just put it, I think, in the Q&A. Hopefully everybody can see that. It shows the Sectigo site. Okay, the Sectigo are the really cheap certs. They're about $13 a year. If GoDaddy is a problem, GoDaddy is like $70 a year. I'm very familiar with GoDaddy, but we have folks using Sectigo, and it's probably the cheapest option. We know it works.
Yeah, and one thing I would add to that, so Mike, your question was, will SecOps be able to assist with that, right? That's specifically probably asking about the certificate, but let me generally state that we are here, right, to support you in this process, right? So opening that case is that first step that then will engage multiple teams across MCNC, right? SecOps team and C&E, and depending on where you are in the process, there's a lot of you that Diane has been working with on this project already for a while now. You just haven't sort of gotten across the finish line, right? So you're at a different phase than those of you that may be on the call right now who have not started this at all, right? And we are here to assist you on all of those steps. I know there's been a lot of content today, so we will work on getting these slides and the content shared with everybody that registered. Again, I don't know how many times we've said it, you have our contact information, so please reach out if you need additional support during this process.
So we have one coming in. Is there a service account needs to be created in Google? Yes. So typically in that stage of the process where we have the fully qualified name, we have the certs on the firewall, then I meet with whoever, IT department, school in a Google. Okay. And yes, we do a service account in Google. Okay. We do an OAuth in Google. We set up the web and mobile app in Google. So it takes about half an hour for that call. I would do it by Zoom with the person.
All right. Any other questions? I am not a glutton for punishment for just staying on Zoom, waiting for questions to come in. So you guys have our contact information. We are happy to answer any questions that you may have. Please reach out. We look forward to working on this with you, and you will be hearing more from us in the coming days around some of those follow-up action items. Thank you, everybody.